And here you are, you're Raymond Benson. There we go.
You're welcome.
I was so excited to speak to you because, yes, I'm somebody who's familiar with you as a writer. When I was a teenager, I read all the James Bond books, and everybody in the Bond community knows Raymond Benson as the James Bond author. But that is just a small snippet of who you are as a person, as a writer. I mean, yeah, you are a musician. You create music. You've written over 40 books. Is that right?
Yes.
Over a dozen short stories.
Yes.
They're making your Black Stiletto series into a TV show or a movie, I believe.
Well, it's optioned. What happened was, you're probably mistaken, the whole Mila Kunis thing, which fell apart. In 2015, ABC optioned it, and Mila Kunis was going to executive produce it as a TV series, and they developed it for a year. You know, had a Emmy-winning scriptwriter write the pilot. They started designing it, thinking about casting, and then the president of ABC changed hands, and the new guy coming in looked at what they were doing and went, I don't want to do this. I'm bringing my own stuff in.
Oh, that must be very frustrating.
Well, it's a typical Hollywood story. So the original producer who got it to ABC still has the option on it, and he's still trying. So we'll see. You know, I mean, right now there's a writer's strike, and so that affects everything. Nothing new is being bought or and so forth. So, but you know,
well, my writer's block is in solidarity with the writer's strike.
Right. Oh yes. Yeah.
I mean, I've read this book. Oh gosh, you can't say it because of my stupid thing. This was such a wonderful read. This is your latest book, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that was a fun one to write, and it got me through the first summer of the pandemic.
It just won an Ippy Award as well, didn't it?
It did. It did. The Ippy Gold, first place.
Very well deserved. I have to admit, I saw you came out with this book around the pandemic, and I was reading a lot of books, and I had not read anything of yours apart from the James Bond stories at that point. So I bought it and I read it, and it was a really delightful, satisfying experience. I would sit outside with a drink and I'd read a chapter, and you're such a craftsman because every single chapter built up on the mystery and gave you the little dopamine hit and was satisfying to read, but there was more to discover. And then the final payoff in the final chapter where you figure out, you know, who the narrator is. It was just so satisfying. I finished it, closed it, and I almost wanted a cigarette afterwards or something.
Well, that's good. I'm really happy to hear that. Yeah, I was really kind of, I think, channeling the Coen brothers. You know, I really wanted to do that kind of a dark comedy. You know, it is a comedy. So there was that, and then the whole Thornton Wilder thing with Our Town has this sort of narrator called the stage manager in the play that was, you know, it's one of my favorite plays too. So I wanted to do sort of a modern take on Our Town, kind of filtered through the Coen brothers, filtered through me. So, and you know, it really takes place in our neighborhood. I mean, I fictionalized the town and the street names and all that, and the characters and the people that live here, but it basically takes place on our street. So, and
it's a Chicago suburb, but I mean, America is one of these places that, you know, it could be my suburb that I live in. I completely understand that. The neighbor who's out there making a racket all the time, and the people coming and go, and the kids on their bicycles, and you just managed to channel it all. And you mentioned the Coen brothers. I can totally see that. It wasn't so much horror based, but there was certain things of Stephen King's writing that you do as well, of having like so much of the drama is based on how the characters are, and the characters aren't all good. They all have flaws. They all have secrets. There are little hints of it. And so there was the suburban background was such a recognizable and resonant place, and yet you managed to have that like sinister thread all the way through that made you feel slightly disquieted.
Yeah, well, you got it then. you picked up on it, so I appreciate that.
I mean, I would love to. How did this book come around? Because, you know, you were writing there's a Black Stiletto series. You write a lot of this. This book seems something unique.
It may be. I mean, my last several books, starting with The Secrets on Chicory Lane, which came out in 2017, I kind of deal with sort of social problems in this country. Secrets on Chicory Lane kind of deals with mental illness and child abuse. It's a pretty dark thriller. In the Hush of the Night came next, and that deals with human trafficking.
Yeah.
And I worked with the Chicago FBI, their human trafficking unit, to do the research, and that was very valuable. It's kind of dark too, but it's a pretty traditional, I think, FBI procedural thriller. Then Blues in the Dark, 2019, that deals with racism and sexism in Hollywood. And so, yeah, I was tackling all these kind of big subjects in these last books. And so for this one, here we are, it's May 2020 when I get the idea to do it. And we've already been in lockdown for 2 months. Everybody's paranoid and freaked out by the pandemic. We don't know what's around the corner. At that time, we knew nothing. There were no vaccines in sight. Everybody was wearing masks and, using hand sanitizer. And, when you go to the grocery store, you'd stay apart from people. It was kind of a creepy feeling to go to the store, because people were just like looking at each other like, are you sick? Are you sick?
Yep.
And, we would, wash our mail, doing really crazy stuff. And I just thought, and at this time, the house next door to us was for sale and had been for 6 months.
Oh.
They were the former owners had moved away, and they were having trouble selling it. My wife and I would take walks in the neighborhood, because that's one thing you could do when you were in lockdown. And I'd pass by that house, and we, my wife would mention, it's kind of creepy that empty house is next door to us for all this long. And that just kind of got my mind going. And taking the situation we were in, the empty house, the pandemic, perfect milieu for a murder mystery.
Yeah.
So I just got excited and invigorated, and I wrote it all through the summer of 2020. And then I think I gave it to my agent in September, I think, in October, and she loved it and thought, oh, this is a surefire hit. And I thought so too. But then as soon as we started submitting it to all the major publishers, they rejected it right off the bat because it takes place during the pandemic.
Which is really interesting, because there are only a couple of creative things I've seen that seem to be set in the pandemic. I mean, there was Knives Out 2. They wore masks, but apart from that, I can't really think of anything. It was like everybody's book.
Right at the beginning there was a lot of resistance to the pandemic. Television was starting to get into the act with commercials, and there was a show called This Is Us where they were wearing masks and really having the pandemic in the show. But the publishers that we sent it to, they would say, well, this is a really great story, we really like it, but we don't think our readers will want to read about the pandemic. How do they know? Have they queried them? Did they do market research to find out, oh, our readers don't want to read about this? I found that absurd, and so did my agent. And but we had to wait, and we waited a whole year to sort of see how things played out. And slowly but surely, some of the more famous writers like Michael Connelly had creep the pandemic into one of his books that came out in early 2021. And so my agent believed in the book enough to go to some smaller publishers that she hadn't approached before. And finally we found this Beaufort Books, who didn't give a whit about the pandemic. They liked the book. And so they published it.
I mean, one of the remarkable things is this book is going to stand there as a test. It's an item of historical relevance now, because people are going to look back at the pandemic, and there aren't going to be books that were set in there or reference it to the same extent that this one does. Whereas the pandemic is always part of the part. You wouldn't be able to have this particular murder mystery happen if the pandemic wasn't going on.
Well, that's, I always wonder, how moving forward, how are stories going to reflect on the pandemic? I mean, COVID is always going to be with us from now on. It's like the flu. We're probably all going to have to get, yearly vaccinations or whatever, if you do that, which I think you should. When I was during the pandemic, when I was reading new mysteries or thrillers, and they were supposedly taking place now, and there was no mention of the pandemic or masks or, COVID or anything like that, I tended to not believe the book. I would like throw it across the room going, come on.
Absolutely.
It's like, you can't write a thriller without 9/11, knowing what happened, so maybe we will be looking back on this like we did the so-called Spanish flu of 1918, as a history thing. But, there are people still wearing masks out there because they might be immune compromised or whatever. And, you still have to be kind of careful, I guess. I don't want to. I had COVID once, and I don't want it again. So
yeah, I had it once, and I was very mild, fortunately, but like it laid me out. I was surprised.
Right. Yeah, mine was not fun. I had it for 3 weeks, and it was pretty bad. So, yeah.
One of the things that I find amazing about this is it seems like you came up with this book before you came up with someone to publish it.
Oh yeah, well, that's the way it always works. You always write a book, and then you find the publisher. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say,
unless you're under contract with a publisher that tends to publish whatever you write. But I'm not in that status.
But I mean, if you look back at your career, you've written a lot of books, and a lot of well-respected books that I guess were commissions. I mean, you wrote the Splinter Cell books and the Metal Gear Solid books, and
right. Well, that's a whole different animal. That we call that work for hire or media tie-in writing, and that's you have to luck into those kind of commissions. That the same way with the Bonds, the James Bond, I was asked to do it by the Fleming estate and Ian Fleming Publications. That's a whole different kettle of fish than writing your own original novel and trying to get it published.
And you seem to have done both.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I've done more actually of my own original stuff, I think. But I've had a lot of publishers. I haven't stuck with the same publisher.
I mean, might I ask just about how you got started? You come from Texas, aren't you? Like Felix Leiter.
Yes, I am. I have a big affinity for Felix Leiter.
Well, I
was more upset that they killed him in No Time to Die than Bond.
That was quite a heart-wrenching scene, actually. I really felt that one. I thought that was very effective, because you're like, oh wow, all the rules are off the table. Right.
Exactly. Well, I mean, my career path has been a long and winding road, to quote Paul McCartney. I started in theater. Growing up, I was a piano player. I got into music very early on. I started playing the piano, but I was also interested in acting and movies and plays. And so in high school, I was in the drama department, and I thought I was going to be an actor. Went to college at the University of Texas at Austin, where they had a really good drama department in those days. We're talking early 1970s now. And I changed my major very quickly to directing. In those, the degree that you could get at this college was it could be a discipline within theater, like playwriting or acting or directing or scene design, whatever your discipline was. So I majored in directing, and I wanted to be a director. And also I was doing a lot of music. Even during my college years, I had to take a gap semester off so I could go to New York and put on a musical I wrote off Broadway.
That's amazing. Now, was that Clue?
No, it was The Resurrection of Jackie Kramer. The book was written by a playwriting professor at UT who became a friend, and we had written it when I was a sophomore, and it got produced at the University of Texas the summer of '75, and that got a lot of interest because a New York director had directed that production, and so we got two productions in play in the spring of 1976, one in Rhode Island and one in New York. And so the only way I could do that was to take a semester off, which put me behind in graduating a year. But it was worth it. That was a great experience for a 20-year-old still in college to go put on have a musical produced in New York.
I know, that's amazing to direct an off-Broadway musical.
Yeah, I didn't direct that production, but I did compose the music and play the piano during for the show. Yeah, and then I came back, finished my degree, and then I started directing a lot. I worked at the Alley Theater in Houston for 1 year before I moved to New York. I finally moved permanently to New York in '79, and I spent several years doing that off Broadway, way off Broadway scene, directing and composing music. But then we're in the early '80s now.
New York must have been a scene then. I mean, New York in the early '80s.
It's still a scene. I mean, I love New York. It's really in my blood. My time in New York was, I was in my 20s and 30s. So, what better time to be in New York City? It was just, it was mind blowing, a sensual experience as well as a intellectually inspiring experience. But anyway, some friends of mine and I were sitting around a table, and somebody said, if you had to write a book, what would you write? And we went around the table and gave our answers. Now, I was a Bond fan from a very young age. My father had taken me to see Goldfinger on the big screen when I was 9.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. And of course that changed my life. And just within a few months of that, the double bill of Dr. No and From Russia with Love appeared. So within about 6 months, at the age of 9, I saw the first 3 Bond movies on the big screen, and I started reading the books. And even though, maybe my 9-year-old mind wasn't sophisticated enough to get everything in the books, I could follow the plots and I could read the stories and appreciate them. And I did so. And then I reread the books like when I was in high school, and I got a lot more out of it. And I've reread the books several times throughout my life. In fact, I reread them all again during the pandemic. So I have a friend that calls them the scriptures.
Oh, I like that. And it's almost become like religious scriptures, because you've got those are the canon ones, and then you have all of the offshoots, like the continuation.
Yeah. Exactly. So anyway, my friends knew I was a Bond fan, and when I gave my answer to write, what book would you write? I said, I'd like to write some kind of encyclopedic coffee table book about the history of James Bond. And they all looked at me and they went, ooh, you should do that. And at the time, there were a couple of books on the movies by themselves. There was a couple of biographies of Ian Fleming. And there were, 2 or 3 books about the novels that were all of these, except for the movie books, were out of print. They were from the 60s. And so I wanted something that had everything: a bio of Fleming, a history of the phenomenon, analyses and critiques of all the books and all the films up to that point. And
they were still making the films. That was peak Roger Moore period, wasn't it?
Right. And I was, 1981 was when this kind of sparked. I was influenced by the publication of John Gardner's first book, License Renewed, and the movie For Your Eyes Only, which I thought was a step forward from what we'd seen of the Roger Moore films. It had more Fleming in it, which I recognized. It was a little more serious. It was a good Bond film, in my opinion. So that kind of got me excited again. After all through the 70s, I was kind of like, yeah, I'll go see the movie, but and there weren't any real books at that time, other than the Christopher Wood thing and the John Pearson book. So it kind of got me invigorated again as a Bond fan. So I started in the fall of '81 writing the Bedside Companion, and slowly but surely I started making contacts of people who might have known Ian Fleming. And in 1982, in the summer, I went to England and I got to meet and interview and talk to people like Ivor Bryce and Fionn Morgan, who was Fleming's stepdaughter, and John Pearson, and other people. And in America, I got to know Ernest Cuneo and Al Hart and other people there. And Joe Bryce, who still lived at Black Hole Hollow Farm in Vermont. And so I got to visit there and sleep in the same bed that Ian Fleming would sleep in when he came to visit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And in that trip in '82, I did meet Peter Jansen Smith, who was the chairman of, at the time it was called Glidrose Publications. Now it's called Ian Fleming Publications. And Peter Jansen Smith was Ian Fleming's literary agent. And he was kind of in charge of all the books section. And I wanted permission to quote from the novels in what I was writing. And so he wanted to see what I was writing before he would make a decision. And we got along well. And while I was in England doing all my interviews and stuff, he read what I had. And I came back to meet with him after the week was over, before I came home. And he gave me permission. He said, carry on. We like what you're doing. So it took 3 years to finish the book. Finally, it came out in 1984 in America. And Peter liked it, and the Flemings liked it. And, we became good friends. We stayed in touch through the rest of the 80s. This is while, John Gardner was writing. And I would do little odd jobs for the Glidrose, no pun intended. And it got published finally in the UK in 1988, and it was a little updated to that point. So this established me as sort of this Bond expert, so to speak. And I got involved with the American Fan Club, Richard Shinkman's fan club. I became vice president, and I would write articles, for Bondage magazine. And even Graham Rye had me do a couple of articles for his fan club and his magazine, 007 magazine. And then, all during this time, I was still doing theater, but not as much, because after The Bedside Companion was published, I had gotten a literary agent in America as a result. And he called me one day fairly soon after the book was published, and he said, don't you like games? Do you play games? And I said, well, yeah, I'm into this sort of Dungeons and Dragons kind of role playing, and pencil and paper stuff. And there was, at the time, computers were just coming into the home, Apple IIc, Commodore, and things like that. And there were these very primitive games, computer games called text adventures. Infocom was a company that was popular. They put out this game called Zork, and Zork 2, and Enchanter, and all this stuff. And these were fantastic, wonderful story-based games, the kind where it says you are in a forest, and there's a path to the east, a path to the north, and a sword lying on the ground. What do you do? And you type, pick up the sword. You now have a sword. What do you do? go east, and then it tells a story as you go through it. And it can be a very complicated story, and you have to solve puzzles and all this stuff and talk to characters. Well, anyway, this my agent said there's this company that is doing these types of games, and they have a James Bond license. And I thought of you. They're looking for a writer, and I said, okay, that sounds fun. And so right off the bat for this company, I did an adaptation of a Stephen King novella called The Mist, and adaptations of A View to a Kill, which was the current movie, and Goldfinger. So that suddenly put my career into a left turn that I never expected. I became a computer game writer and designer. And then I started working for some other big companies. And this took me into the mid-90s. And I moved around the country with my family. I got married in the late 80s, had a child, and but we moved back to Texas in the early 90s to work for one company. Then to Baltimore, Maryland to work for another company, and then finally to the Chicago area, which is where we've stayed since that time. And I did, some big games that got a lot of attention, like Ultima 7, The Black Gate. And
I played these games. I mean, yeah. I'm familiar with Zorg. My brother had a Commodore PET, so we used to write text. And I mean, to me, that's amazing. As a writer, that's you need to be a good writer, but you have to think so differently to how, writing a novel or something like that. It seems a lot more sophisticated.
Right. Well, that's where I really honed my fiction writing. And, the plot, you have to have not just one plot, but you have to have branches of plots. So for all the alternate paths. And, the scripts ended up being the size of a giant phone book. But, I had written a first novel in the late 80s, and Peter did read it, and he complimented me on it. We both felt that it's the proverbial first novel that you put in a drawer and never unearth it again. But I think he saw that I could write a novel, and more importantly, finish it.
Yeah.
So he had that in mind, I guess, and the fact that I'd been doing all this, computer stuff. In late 1995, he called me out of the blue. And he said, Raymond, John Gardner has said that he wants to hang up the hat, retire from doing this. And we wondered if you'd like to give it a shot. What? It was completely unexpected, something I didn't campaign for. And something pretty frightening, actually, too. But sure, I was game to try. And I had to sort of audition in a way. I had to come up with an outline of a story, which is really the hardest part. And, first we had a big conversation about, well, if we do this, what direction are we going to go? Do we stay contemporary like John Gardner was doing, just set the books in the current time period? Or do we go back to the 1950s or 60s, try to do period pieces? And because GoldenEye had just come out and was such a big hit in relaunching the series, basically, he felt that we should stay in sync with the current movies and keep them contemporary in the 90s. He also, he said, why don't you make your M a woman?
Yeah.
Like the films. And he also said, why don't you, try to make them more cinematic, make them kind of like the movies, with more action and a little more humor. And I said, okay, that's fine. But I want to keep the Bond character the way Fleming wrote him. I want him to be kind of, all of his vices intact. I want him to still smoke and drink and be a womanizer and, kind of be a brooder in a way. So he said, well, that's fine if you can make it work, because he would be a little anachronistic in the late 90s. But that would make him stand out. I mean, that's who the character is. So
absolutely.
I say I was like, I was using Fleming's Bond filtered through a film Bond, creating movie plots filtered through Fleming plots. No, Fleming structure. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no problem.
And I mean, that must have been quite intimidating just from, I mean, how do you write a contemporary story with a character who like has a biography? He was born in 1920. It's like, how do you approach that?
You don't really talk about his age, just the way Gardner never really talked about his age. Yeah. He's a little older, a little wiser, but he's still the same guy, it's, I mean, Batman would be how old?
Absolutely. But
exactly.
I mean, to me, it's amazing. You were given the opportunity to write this novel about this iconic literary character. This was going to be your first novel, wasn't it? Your first published novel.
First published novel, yes, that's right. So anyway, I wrote the outline to us. I knew if the book was published, it would be 1997.
Yep.
So I thought, okay, what is England concerned with right now? Well, there's the handover of Hong Kong that was imminent. And I thought, wow, that might be a good, interesting setting for a story. And I started doing research on the history of Hong Kong, and why did Britain own it for 100 years, and why were they giving it back? And I learned all that stuff and figured out who my villain would be and what the story would be, and then wrote the outline. And that had to be approved by Peter and the Fleming estate, as well as the British publisher and the American publisher. So that was a little intimidating, but it got approved like that. And then I had to write the first 4 chapters, same approval process. And once that was done, it was March 1996, and that's when they announced that I got the contract. So.
And it's a wonderful book, 0-10. I just listened to the audiobook of it again recently because I hadn't read it in years. But it's like you bring us straight in with like a training mission and on the beach and a big fight scene. And I think it's so interesting as an American, like you, I think you bring in an outside perspective of everything that was going on in Hong Kong that perhaps a British author wouldn't, because Brits tend to be a bit tunnel visioned about these things. And I think from an outsider's perspective, you've got to see and explain a larger picture and make me see things from the outside in.
Well, great. Yeah, and I did travel to Hong Kong too. I went to, almost all my locations that I wrote about. I traveled and walked in Bond's footsteps. I would write the outline first. I would do the research, figure out kind of what locations I would want, and then write the outline, and then go travel and basically follow the footsteps of the outline to see all the places I'd need to see. And I would stay in the hotels that Bond stayed in and eat the food and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that just helped inform the writing.
And before that book got published, there was a short story in Playboy, wasn't there? Because I got that copy of Playboy to read it. My parents were quite permissive about those things. They were quite excited. They're like, oh, James Bond's going to be in Playboy again. That's quite a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that was my idea. I'd been a fan of Playboy, growing up as a young American heterosexual male. But anyway, I knew that Playboy had a long history with Bond in the 60s. They were the first magazine really in America to publish Ian Fleming's short stories and excerpts from his novels. And then they had the film pictorials from then on. And I had sent Hugh Hefner a copy of The Bedside Companion because I knew he was a fan.
And he's got plenty of beds.
What's that?
He has plenty of beds as well. So
yes, that's right. He has plenty of bedside companions too. But anyway, he wrote me back, and which totally surprised me. And he said, if you're ever in town, you're invited to come to the mansion, for movie night or something, And I didn't meet him face to face in the early 90s. I was in LA for something, and I got to go and meet him. But anyway, so I suggested to Peter Jansen Smith, once I got the deal, the contract, I said, why don't we kind of start off my tenure with a short story in Playboy? I bet we could get it, because I have an in. And he said, sure, let's try. And so I pitched it to Hef, and he said, absolutely. So I did write Blast from the Past first before I had written the first 4 chapters of 0-10. But then I stepped back and wrote Blast from the Past. And Playboy had to cut a third out of it for space, which I was not happy about. So the full-length version of Blast from the Past is now published in that anthology called the Union Trilogy. That's the only place you can get the director's cut. So, and looking at Blast from the Past now, I can see how early it is for my writing. I mean, it's not fully developed there. None of the short stories I think are very strong personally. And the second one, Midsummer Night's Doom, that was a novelty. That was a novelty story that was commissioned by Playboy. It was meant to be a joke. So there's that. But the novels I really poured my heart into and did a lot of work on them. They each took a year. However, the movie novelizations, they were done much more in a time frame that was pretty nerve-wracking. I had to write those in about 6 weeks each.
I mean, that's an amazing thing. As a writer, to me, that's where you got a commission. First of all, what was it like getting the commission to write the novelizations of movies, and how did you fit them into your own continuity, and how did you even approach that?
Right. Well, basically the way it worked was whoever was the Bond author of record at Ian Fleming Publications does the novelizations, if there's going to be a novelization. And so John Gardner did GoldenEye because he was still the author then. But by the time of Tomorrow Never Dies, I was in place. And so they would send me the script. Eon and Ian Fleming Publications, they co-owned the novelizations. So Ian Fleming Publications was in charge of getting the novel written, and then Eon would approve it and have, they used it as a marketing tool, basically. That's why it's called a tie-in.
Yeah.
And that's how they looked at them. So Tomorrow Never Dies, I think is the best of the 3 novelizations I did. I think I had more freedom to invent more background stories and stuff. Eon was fine with that. They were, I was writing it while they were filming it. So I would get faxed pages from, daily of rewrites, so I'd have to change what I was writing. But yeah, I had 6 or 7 weeks to finish the novel because the publisher had to have it 6 months before publication. So the novel was turned in maybe even before the filming had finished. So that's why there are differences between the novelizations and the finished films. So there's that. So yeah, there were years when I was doing double duty. I was writing the main original novel as well as then suddenly having to write a novelization or a short story, So.
And I mean, it must have been challenging. I know when I read License to Kill by John Gardner, that had the very weird thing. He wants to keep it with his continuity. So Felix Leiter got his arm chewed off again.
Yeah.
And so these are the challenges that go in. So
I know. I would reference in the first book, 0-10. I think I referenced a couple of characters in John Gardner's book, some of the women. But then I decided I probably shouldn't do that. From then on, I did not do that. I would continue to reference Fleming, though. Fleming was the canon. Fleming was the base, the foundation of all of our books. So I would reference stories and bring back certain characters because I found that interesting. What would Tiger Tanaka be like in today's modern world? How would he behave? And people like that. So, a few characters I brought back, but mostly it was all my original stuff. It was my stories, my characters. There was a lot of me in those books too. I'm the one that takes Bond to eat Tex-Mex in Texas.
But they're really good. I think with the John Gardner ones, I don't know what it is. There were elements, there were books that I liked, and there were elements that I liked and things. But reading them again is kind of a bit of a slog. Whereas reading your books is fun and enjoyable and immersive, and it's the same sort of excitement as you got when you read the Fleming books.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think there is an accessibility in my books that perhaps is not there in some of the other books. Maybe just because of my cinematic writing style. I don't know. I like all the other authors in their books. We're all in the same family. We're all brothers and sisters now. I'm proud and happy to be part of this family of Bond authors, and I don't take it for granted. I'm very grateful that I got to do this. It really kind of set me going as a writer. I quit my day job as a computer game designer as soon as 0-10 was published, and I became a full-time freelance writer from then on.
And your first book under your own idea came out not long afterwards, wasn't it? That was Evil Hours.
Evil Hours, yeah, that came out in 2001. But then that was just a weird kind of online publisher that published that and did sort of a print on demand kind of thing, which was very, very new at that time. Ebooks were hardly a thing yet, and they were experimenting in this what would become a phenomenon of ebooks. And they commissioned me to write a novel. That's how Evil Hours came about. But then I wasn't totally happy with that version, and so I did some revisions to it, and it was published again in 2004. But yeah, that's my first original novel, and it takes place in West Texas, kind of in a fictional town of where I grew up, and it's inspired by a true crime. Because that's where you built out your own. Now people know Raymond Benson not just as the Bond guy, but as full-on mystery noir. You've created some really wonderful things that people love. Like Black Stiletto is that series is kind of iconic on its own. Yes, well, I feel that the Black Stiletto 5-book serial is my magnum opus.
Yeah,
I think it's probably the greatest thing I've ever written, and personally. I love it, and and there's a lot of me and my world in it. My mother-in-law had Alzheimer's, and so there's a lot of that our experience with her in this book. It takes place in a lot of the places I've lived, like Texas, New York, Chicago. It's all, I'm using all the worlds that I know in this, and it was just a hell of a lot of fun to write, and I hope it gets made someday.
Absolutely. It seems the looking back at things through sort of two different lenses is a trend throughout your work. You've got The Secrets of Chicory Lane as well. It's about people who were friends at high school and then revisit, and there are some dark elements in there. But it's in a number of your books you have sort of almost two time frames referenced.
Yes, I do. I do that a lot. Where there's events in the present day and then events in the past, and we go back and forth in time. All the Black Stilettos do that. Blues in the Dark, Secrets on Chicory Lane, Evil Hours. That might be it. I've noticed that several of my books have to do with grown children finding some secret about their parents, or especially their mother. I don't know why that is. My mom had no secrets, so but I don't know why that is kind of a theme in some of my original books.
I kind of like that because it is a discovery. You get to a certain age as a child and you suddenly realize that your parents had a whole life without you.
Yes.
And could be quite cool and do cool things. I mean, that was one of the cool things about Black Stiletto. I mean, how cool would it be to figure out that your mom was like a vigilante?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's how it happened.
So I know I don't want to. I was aiming for like the psychiatrist's hour, but I do have just a couple of quick questions, if I may ask you. First of all, are you working on anything right now?
For the past year, I've been working on a ghostwriting project that I can't really talk about because I have an NDA. But all I can say is that has been very fulfilling, has been very lucrative, and that it was a perfect project for me. And it was so good that I'm going to do it again over the next year. So I'm not sure when another Raymond Benson novel will be coming out. I am getting, I think, I was putting out almost 2 books a year. I was averaging 2 books a year for 25 years. And I'm starting to slow down. I mean, I'm pushing 70 now. And another book will appear when it appears. That's all I can say. I have ideas percolating. I'm taking some trips in the coming months that might be inspiring. So we'll see. But in the meantime, I'm still writing, and I'm still making a living doing the writing. And what I'm writing are thrillers.
Oh, go ahead.
My name won't be on them, but that's what I'm doing.
I mean, you wrote the Splinter Cell books. The novelizations didn't have your name attached to them either, and you've written.
Yeah,
I imagine you've written a lot more that doesn't have your name on.
That's right. I was the first David Michaels. When the Splinter Cell books started, the publisher in the Tom Clancy estate wanted a pseudonym for the author or authors that would be doing these books. So there have been, I think, 3 or 4 David Michaels, but I was the first. I did the first 2. Yeah,
the original.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems one of the things that I've seen a lot of people say about your writing is just that it's craftsmanlike, as in you manage to deliver very effectively. You never have any confusion with your stories about which character is doing what's going on in the plot. They're very, very coherent and tight, and you have this wonderful way of like building on escalating the tension, keeping people reading through the pages. And I wonder, do you think some of that comes from the fact that you took on a lot of commission work? You work for video games, you've done a lot of stuff where you were told to write this as opposed to just having to rely on your inspiration?
I think it all goes back to my theater training. Mm-hmm. My directing professor was, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie The Paper Chase from 1973 that had John Houseman as a law professor, and he won an Oscar for supporting actor for that. He was like this, in the movie, he was this feared professor who everybody was scared of, and yet he was brilliant, and became like a mentor to the main character and everything. I had a guy like that in the drama department. He was the head of the directing program, and he wrote the most used directing textbook for universities all around the country. And he was feared, just like people were scared of him and everything. But we got along, and he taught me a lot. And he really emphasized preparation. We had to, before we directed anything, we had to write what we called a preparation, which was a big, thick analysis of the play, which would go beat by beat, saying, okay, what's happening here? What are the characters really saying? And what's the subtext? And what's the tempo here? How should this be played? And it taught me how to tell a story. That's basically what it was. He taught storytelling and how to convey storytelling, how to communicate a story, both, in writing and visually. So
that's so fascinating.
Yeah. So I used that in my computer game designing, and I used it in all the techniques and things I used in my writing of novels. And, you know, my outlines for each, I do outline every novel. And, you know, in the writing community, people say you're either a plotter, like I am, or a pantser. And that means you write by the seat of your pants. Stephen King is an incredible pantser. He can sit down and just take off and write a great book. You know, Lee Child was the same way with his Reacher books. I admire pantsers. I don't see how they do it, but that's incredible. I have to really plot it. I have to know where I'm going. I have to know how it ends. I have to know all the bumps in the road and the arc beforehand. I plan all that stuff out. And so the outline is the most difficult, hair-pulling, angst-ridden portion of the process, because that's when I'm really writing the book in a prose treatment that's about 20 pages. And it's broken out by block paragraphs, and each paragraph represents a chapter. What happens in that chapter? And I spend a lot of time doing it, sometimes a couple of months at least, to just do these 20 pages. And, you know, it's a lot easier to throw out a paragraph than it is a full chapter you've already written. That doesn't work.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that, like with this book in particular, I think that's why it was so satisfying, because it wrapped up and it was like you could sit back and there weren't any loose threads. There weren't any things you didn't understand. It was really, really satisfying. And I guess that's because you planned it out beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that. That's and, you know, Peter, when I started doing the bonds, he required an outline. They said, you know, you have to do an outline before each book because we want to see what you want to do. So that really trained me in how to do the outlines for my novels.
Well, if you ever want to teach a class on that, I know there'll be lots of people who probably want to be part of it, including myself.
Yeah, well, the problem with teaching a class, I'd have to read everybody's novels. I don't think I want to do that.
Well, I won't keep you too much longer. Thank you so much, Raymond. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. I hope I get to do it again. I hope I get to meet you face to face one of these days.
Well, you know, I do come to New York at least once a year. So
you were just here for Thriller Fest, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I was there.
And how was that?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's always great. It's my favorite conference, and I've been going since the beginning. And, you know, a lot of big names show up to that thing too. You know, I mean, Jeffrey Deaver and I just hung out there together. You know, he's been a friend a long time. So, you know, the sole two Americans who wrote Bond novels. You know?
And he's a terrific writer as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's great. He's great.
I know there was a writer called Robin Young from the UK who was at Thriller Fest as well. I was like, I know two writers who are at Thriller Fest.
Robin Young was there this time?
Yes, she's just been posting pictures of it on Facebook.
Oh, okay. I don't think I was aware of that. So,
we'll have to.
Well, it's a big conference. I mean, you know, it's hard to see who all is there.
No. Oh, but that's amazing. Well, Raymond, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I realize I'm just some bloke off the internet, but I'm a huge fan, and I really admire like everything that you bring to what writing is. Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate it. And finally, where can people find out more about you and go places? And I mean, obviously, you can just type in Raymond Benson, and you're quite big, so it will turn up. Yeah. Do you have a website or anything? Yeah, my website is raymondbenson.com, and that has everything, you know, links to books and all that, and all the, you know, the main publishing news is going to be there. But my Facebook page, I have two Facebook pages. One is an author page that kind of mimics the website. It's only, you know, major news every now and then. But my personal page, Raymond Benson, that's where, you know, I post a lot, and I post almost daily stuff, you know. So you can find me there. I am on Twitter, but boy, am I not happy with Twitter these days. I don't know what's going to happen there. I don't post a lot on Twitter, but that's it. That's where I'm, you know. And you used to host like movie watchings together in Chicago and things, didn't you? Right. I teamed up with one of Chicago's film critics. His name is Dan Geyer. We created a program called Dan and Raymond's Movie Club. We started it in 2007, so we've been doing it 16 years. Wow.
Yeah, and we would present these movie discussions at area libraries that would pay us and come to these things, and they became very, very popular. They were kind of like a Siskel and Ebert show live in front of an audience, only it was 2 hours long. And instead of doing current movies, we would take a topic of cinema history and discuss the best of that topic. For example, we would, science fiction films. What are our favorite science fiction films? And we would get clips and show the clips and talk about the movies, and tell jokes and stuff. And it went very well. We've decided to wind it down. We don't want to become like the two old guys on the Muppets up in the balcony. And so we have a few shows left in the fall, but our last show will be in December of 2023.
Oh, so people need to catch you while they still can.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you so much, Raymond. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a real treat talking to you. I can't express how much I appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
Thanks again for having me.
I'm Roland Hume. I've sold 67,000 copies of my books. If you want to find out how I did it, I've got a link right here you can click. And otherwise, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more videos coming soon. Thank you.